Two, one. Hey, everybody. Episode. What are we doing now? 17?
Yes,
17.
absolutely.
All right, and we are. We're going to be talking about something a little more sobering and serious, and whatever. I guess more. We were talking before we hit record about how painful this might be. Hopefully, not too painful. So if you're listening and you're not sure what we're talking about, at the end of the previous of our episode 16, we started to talk a little bit about a topic that was suggested by a mutual friend of ours, Thomas, um, on churches that abuse people, that are spiritual abuse in churches. And I think it's one of these things. First of all, it's a great topic. I'm glad. Thank you, Thomas, for suggesting it. It's probably not something that I think we would have naturally jumped into. I mean, at least not to do an entire uh, video podcast on it. But obviously, it is something that is very real. People listening to us might either be a already in a church like this, and they need to know what to do about it. B, they used to be in a church like this, and they're still kind of dealing with the fallout, the emotional and spiritual, kind of recovery process of that. And or there may be people that are interested in house church and might need to be aware of some warning signs like, oh, I'm in this house church and everything's great, but there's a couple of things I'm not sure about. And hopefully we can help you avoid uh, making some really bad mistakes in that sense. So I only have a few things to say on this topic. I think you have a lot more experience having gone through something firsthand in your actual life more than I have. So I would just say I think we started to talk about this at the end of the last episode. So I think there are different categories of churches that abuse, or that there are churches that where maybe the leader who starts the church is a charlatan. He's a fake. He's just doing this to make money and to control people and to get his way. And those are probably the most extreme version of this kind of a church. The second version might be a church that starts off great. Um, Everyone involved, it means nothing and intends nothing but the best. And even the Lord is able to accomplish some very amazing and beautiful things for the kingdom through this church. But just as the way the structure is set up, and certain people begin to gain a little bit more power and influence, human nature takes over. Maybe you have a system of checks and balances that someone's able to find a loophole in, and they can kind of live in the shadows there in between things and get away with stuff for a long time. And then it just slowly becomes something that's corrupted, even though it didn't start out that way. Um, and then I think, is there another category? Maybe another category would be, oh, okay, well, this was my personal experience. This is the closest I can share. I was a part of a church for a while. That was a great church, and it wasn't abusive, at least in that what we're going to talk about. However, there was a pastor who was senior to me, who had a lot of emotional issues and who did make it very painful and difficult to be around. Not all the time, but sort of like with the swinging of his moods, you knew that, hey, this is a bad day to be around him. And he would kind of just, I come out of meetings with him and just feel slimed. And so no one else in the church was aware of that, unless you were serving under this guy and he was sort of your boss. You would never know it. So I wouldn't necessarily call that church an abusive church, although there were people within it who might have been considered in some ways abusive or manipulative or emotionally, someone difficult to be around. But anyway, having laid out all those possible paths, I will defer to you, my friend. What,
To
what,
pick a path,
yeah, you said you've been doing a lot of thinking about this topic as well, and you had some thoughts about maybe where we could go with it. So,
yeah, and we can sort of start with the painful part, the
okay,
painful piece.
get that out of the way, just like a band-aid, rip it right
Yeah,
off,
just rip it right off, let it bleed. Uh,
raw, exposed. Yeah.
Flesh, yeah. No, again, and um, it was so interesting that Thomas brought this up at the same time that I sort of ventured onto Facebook, which I am not wont to do, and posted a thought from the Dallas Willard book that I was enjoying, and had somebody from my past come ripping out of the woodwork to sort of generally castigate me for what may or may not have happened 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So I really began to learn the value of Facebook right there. If you ever want to sort of relive some unpleasant piece of your life, just throw it on out there.
Yeah.
But it was because, like I sort of alluded to our last conversation, the group that I was involved in did end up in a book. It did end up in a book that was supposedly about abusive churches. And the thing that was significant to me in that, just like with the Pilgrim Church book, is your adversaries always get to write, your history. In this particular case, there was one person who had some issues even when they were, in our midst, who ended up becoming the spokesperson for the abuse. And I think that the sensitivity to this is on this level. It's like so many things in our society where we've taken words and we've completely reduced them almost to meaninglessness. Abuse now has such a huge scope that you can go from everything from someone repeatedly physically, harming someone, down to saying something that someone feels is a slight or offense to them. And that whole spectrum of things is now called abuse. And I think there are, like you said, churches that truly are abusive environments where people are basically locked in. The compound gate is closed. You don't get out. You do what they say or whatever the repercussions are. Our situation was not that. I mean, the door always locked on the inside. I mean, if you wanted to leave, you could leave. There were a number of different situations that I'll kind of get into that made that unpleasant and uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, I think the way I want to kind of push this is because most of us won't end up in a Jonestown compound drinking Kool-Aid.
Please God, let's hope not. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Although I think eventually though we should talk about how to avoid that, because I think there are specific warning signs about that kind of a group that you can identify early on and make sure you do avoid that kind of thing.
Exactly. And I'd kind of like to push it from that extreme sort of into a more middle ground. And that is sort of exchanging the sort of worn phrase abuse and replacing it with maybe a more accurate phrase, and that would be unhealthy.
Yep.
Because I think that's really the bottom line. What we were involved in was not abusive in that kind of way. Well, what we were involved in, again, to your point, the group that starts out a certain way and metastasizes over time and becomes unhealthy. And it becomes unhealthy because of certain internal things that were not addressed as they began to progress into the arena of concern. So that's kind of what I'd like to sort of focus this on. And I sort of outlined just from some experience, kind of warning signs, if I will, of unhealthy situations.
Okay.
And I think if we take and kind of look at these, we see that there's a whole lot more in our faith experience that could be considered unhealthy, that we wouldn't consider abusive. But at the end of the day, I think where we want to be is the place where we can grow, where we can be nurtured, where we can develop Christ-likeness, that we can manifest his character and his person. And so in some of these cases, the unhealthy piece just needs to be addressed. We have to have the courage to sort of to call ourselves out, if you will.
Yeah.
and say, hey, you know what, we need to take a look at this. So when I was kind of thinking about this, what is, if you were to say, what is one of the primary signs, one of the more basic signs that you're in an unhealthy situation or a situation's becoming unhealthy, and that is we lose sight of Christ as the head. And I think this to me is a huge warning, okay, for so many different environments, because we have strong personalities, charismatic individuals, and they take this place of prominence that sort of outshines everything else. Um, and we lose sight of Christ as the head, and that we're all connected to him as the body, and it becomes about this individual,
Hmm.
or this maybe this group of individuals, and they begin to take the top place. And you say, well, why is that so bad? I mean, look at all the great things that are happening because these great talented people, etc., and gifted people. And I think the danger is in what comes from that, not what starts with that, though I think that is worthy of its own discussion, is where does that go? What's the progression of that? And that kind of leads into the second thing. And by the way, Keith, anytime you feel, so led, just jump right in here. I'll
Yeah. I
slow
will.
down. Okay.
I have the
Um,
gift of interruption. I can do
oh,
that.
sweet. I didn't realize there was such a gift, but
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
it's necessary. Well, if we lose sight of that, okay, and if the pendulum swings away from that preoccupation with Jesus and sort of this being enamored with the individual, or being enamored with this strong personality, or this giftedness, what eventually in my experience happens is then allegiance to that leader or that group is seen as exactly equal to allegiance to Christ.
Hmm.
And I think the language that gets used is not allegiance, it's submission.
Hmm.
Okay, and you need to be subject to leadership. And wives need to be subject to their husbands. And while there's a biblical precedent for all of that and
Hmm.
foundation for that, I think the piece that's missing is what is that? Is the understanding, the teaching that lies at the foundation of the idea of submission, and that is the love
Hmm.
that precedes that. In that passage in Ephesians says, as Christ loved the church, and then it's wives be subject. You know what I mean? That there's something precedes that submission, and that is love.
Yeah.
I mean, that genuine Christ-like sacrificial love precedes submission. And submission is not the idea that anything and everything that dribbles out of their mouth is some godly pearl,
Hmm.
but that I have respect for their godliness and example, and I give heed to and open my ear and heart to the kinds of instruction or direction that they would give. But I think, again, in our case, over time, what happens is gifted and charismatic and strong personalities begin to communicate, either overtly or covertly, that listening to them is the same thing as listening to God. Now, you have that in the Catholic Church, right? I mean, throughout history, Catholics weren't allowed to read the Bible because only priests and the Pope could really tell you what God had to say to you. So that sort of allegiance, or in the language of submission and yieldedness, that's when unhealthy situations become sort of on the fast track for me. Okay, because now there's another authority in my life. Now there's another a person that takes the place of Jesus in my life, and as a consequence, if they are good-hearted people, okay, there may not be a great deal of harm initially, but over time that can never be healthy, regardless of how good-hearted that person is. Do you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Because again, we've allowed that person or that group to take the place of God in our lives, and that never can be healthy.
Yeah.
And sort of that leads to this next sort of thing is, again, when you have that place where now submission and authority is sort of the watchwords of our relationship, then conformity and performance starts to supersede authenticity and identity. And it all becomes about conforming to the standards and the norm and upholding the testimony and doing the will of God. And it's all of this performance-based acceptance and involvement.
Yeah.
And instead of living out of who we are in Christ, then that's where that legalism starts setting in. And I'm not talking about the legalism that comes from, being those that ascribe to keeping the Ten Commandments. I'm talking about that subtle legalism, and not so subtle sometimes, that's sort of part and parcel to our evangelical experience. We're supposed to look a certain way. We're supposed to act a certain way. We're supposed to talk a certain way. Our kids are supposed to do a certain thing. They can never be this and never be that. And woe to us if they happen to be kids every now and then and, throw a pumpkin through the wrong window or whatever. And so we start building our lives on the basis of the masks that we wear.
Mm-hmm.
And become more and more bound up and more limited and more concerned about what others think about us rather than living authentically and openly and honestly with one another. And to me, this is where, if you were to say what's the sort of threshold point to real unhealthiness, I think this is, to me, sort of where it sort of forms that threshold point, because I think the next place you go is creating a culture of shaming and blaming.
Mm-hmm.
And shame is a powerful tool.
Yep.
I mean, coaches use it to get the most out of their athletes, and parents use it with their kids to try and get them to toe the line. It's just such a powerful tool because it speaks to all of our fears of rejection and exclusion and loss and all of that kind of thing. And frankly, it speaks to that deep piece in us that's not convinced that we're lovable, that's not convinced that anybody could, ever truly love us if they truly knew who we were. And I think the other piece of that, the blaming piece of that, gets manifested in scapegoating. There's an amazing book, and I read it sort of in the middle of the things falling apart. It's called People of the Lie by M. Scott Peck. And he talks in the book about the hope for healing human evil. And he defines evil in a very specific way. It's not a consciouslessness, that you're a psychopath or something like that, and you have really no feelings, and you could put two in the back of somebody's head and go have a Coke and not know the difference between the two acts. It's about rejecting what our conscience is telling us about our shortcomings and our sin. Okay, and he really hones into this idea that scapegoating is one of the powerful tools in an abusive situation. And it's all about justifying ourselves. It's all about validating our own purity. And since there's that inner voice that's saying, no, you're not who you pretend to be. Instead of just embracing that honestly and openly and seeking the help of others, we begin to find fault. We begin to shift blame. We begin to, again, find that scapegoat that we can transfer the focus and attention to and accuse them of all kinds of different things to hide the fact that we understand what's lacking in ourselves. And I think this is when the environment becomes truly unhealthy and truly caustic. And again, the bandwidth of what that looks like goes everything from the mild kind of stuff you see in the big evangelical environments where there's sort of a shunning of those that don't quite measure up, to when you get to small, very intense and very relational groups, that can become vicious. And and it's always in the background, because after all, we're good Christians here. It's always sort of in the background, but it's there. And again, it creates this toxic environment one with another, where again, it's all about hiding and then projecting what we feel about ourselves onto others, so we can escape addressing it with God and with those that He's put with us. So in that kind of a situation, I think it leads to We had a thing one time, again, I think I shared it, where, there was a discussion about whether we should let our kids go and play in church soccer leagues that played on Saturday, because we were all about all day for the Lord on Sunday. And it was like, well, if we let people do that, they might go to that church,
Yep.
they might get, and it's like, seriously? So I think this creation of this culture of shaming and blaming then kind of leads into this building walls instead of doors and windows. And the idea is we want to build walls to protect ourselves from that defiling influence that's out there. You know what I mean? We don't want the compromise of the world. We want to maintain our purity. We want to maintain our testimony. We want to, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in my assessment of that statement about the soccer match, it wasn't at all about keeping anybody out. It was about keeping people in.
Yep.
And if we can shame and blame and keep the walls high enough that people will stay here, as if that's the end all, do all, be all of our gathering, instead of opening doors and windows. And to me, the doors and windows are the influences of other groups and other ways of thinking about things that enlarge you rather than constrict you. And in our case, again, the kind of classic example for me was the Weekend to Remember. I think it's a rainy event my wife and I went to, and it was awesome. And we spent the weekend going through the exercises and was deeply moved by the time. And we went back and said, wow, if you get an opportunity, sign up, go. And somebody, one of the elders came by and said, don't tell people that. We can do that ourselves. I said, no, we can't. We suck at this. That's why it was so awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, open the windows, let the breeze in, open the door, let people go back and forth into experiences that enlarge themselves, enlarge them. And then as a consequence, they can bring that back and encourage others in the same way. And so the building of the walls and instead of the doors and windows, I think, leads to this embracing an attitude of exclusivity. And for us, it wasn't exclusivity with regard to salvation. It was exclusivity with regard to vision and reward.
Yep.
We understood what the church was all about. We understood it better than anybody. In fact, we had an elder stand up on a Sunday morning one time and said, God isn't that EV free. Okay, the church up the street from us. Seriously? No, I'm not saying God, is inhabiting institutional structures and organizations, but when two or three are gathered, there I am in the midst. Okay, and I personally don't feel it matters whether it's a coffee shop or a cathedral. He's in the midst. But there's this attitude of exclusivity, and for us, there was the piece about, we get divine revelation and what the church is all about, and we get the heavenly vision, and nobody really understands that, and that was all connected with reward.
Mm-hmm.
The doing was not about salvation; the doing was about reward. I personally feel that there is a biblical precedent for thinking about reward. And I also feel that if the focus is on the reward, then we've lost it before we've begun, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I think that's, you look at the parable of the servants with the talents. They just went and invested. He didn't say if, then. He just said here. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yep.
And they took it upon themselves to say, hey, what cool things could I do with this? Mm-hmm. Except for one. Who thought he understood the heavenly vision and thought he understood the game, and so he took the talent and hid it in the dirt, because after all, the master was unreasonable, and so here, you've got what you gave me.
I gave it back to you. There it is. Yeah.
That's right. I got nothing. There's no blame to be cast upon me. Okay, yep. I did nothing bad.
Yep.
So, and instead of the idea, wow, what an awesome opportunity to serve and invest and see what God will do. So there's this embracing of exclusivity. And then I think the piece that goes along with that, or maybe it's sort of underneath all of that, is personal advancement and reputation trumps washing one another's feet. And I think this speaks to, particularly to leaders. And by leaders, I'm not saying those that have gotten the degree and and all of the official seals and certifications. I'm talking about those in the midst that people look to, and who do cast a shadow, if you will, and are moving forward, and people are emulating them. Like Paul says, follow my example, But when my gift or my ministry takes precedence over washing another's feet, taking that low place, having that Christ-like attitude of service and sacrifice for another, then it sort of goes back to the first of we've lost sight of Christ as the head. And now it's all about promoting that individual and honoring that individual and making a special place for that individual. And to me, that's, I'm sure you've probably got some things to add, or the other things could be added to that. But when those things begin to creep in, and maybe it's not in the same progression, maybe the first and the last are evidenced for, but when those things become evidenced, I think that's where, again, if we're not people of the lie, that's when we, throw the flag on ourselves, okay, or like golf, call the penalty on yourself, and say, you know what, we need to discuss this. We need to sit down and really have a heartfelt discussion about this and bring it before the Lord and really seek the Lord for a corrective for this, because we don't want to live in an unhealthy environment. I want to live in an environment, in a faith environment that's so safe that the worst about me can be known, and I'm loved more in the telling, not less. I want to live in a faith environment where there's no shaming and blaming. There's affirmation and support. I want to live in an environment where we live authentically out of who we are in Christ, rather than the masks. I want to live in an environment where Jesus is head, that Christ is head, and that we're all connected in this really wonderful, vital, vibrant a relationship, both with him and with one another. So I think, again, going back to where we started with this, and maybe Thomas's, question, I think there are situations of really severe, oppressive, and abusive use of power and authority and those kinds of situations. In those situations, if you know someone in it, you got to get them out of it.
Yep.
If you're in it, you got to run.
Yep. I agree. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I think and by the way, man, that was beautiful. I hope you're going to write that up as a blog, because if you're not, I'm going to just do it for you. But I made some notes. That was a master class. I think that was really, really good. And I made some notes here that I wanted to kind of just make a couple of comments on some things you pointed out. What I thought was really interesting was, as you were describing, because what you walked through us was a little bit of a progression of, like, it kind of starts this way, and then it kind of becomes like that, then it slowly becomes like this, and then eventually the fruit of it is this. And honestly, as you were mapping out that progression, in my mind, I'm thinking, you know what? If I started a dot at Jesus, and I wove that line through the apostles in the book of Acts, and through the first century church, and then through the second century, and then we have Cyprian and Irenaeus and all these, and then we come up to Constantine. You know what I would realize is that everything you just described is almost exactly the path that the Christian church slowly devolved into, starting with Jesus. You there? Did I lose you again, man? All right. Why does this always happen to us? It just always happens. Anyway, Dan, are you going to come back? This always happens. Well, what I was going to point out was that the Christian church started off being about Jesus as the head. The apostles, the disciples and the apostles in the first century were very much about that idea of all of us being brothers and not loading it over one another and that kind of a thing. But throughout church history, unfortunately, what we see is that eventually we did experience this subtle shift where the emphasis was placed on the facilitator, which got translated into the bishop, such to the point where if the bishop wasn't available, no one was allowed to meet. Hey, there you are. I just kept talking because I didn't know if I was going to get you back.
You know what's so funny? My wife was in here. She goes, "Oh, can I sit in here?" I go, "No, you'll make me nervous." I go, "But I'm wondering how long it'll be before our technology breaks down."
Right.
Because every time we start talking about something that I think is pretty profound,
Yep.
boom.
There it is. So I don't know. Yeah, what I was starting to say was that what you outlined progression-wise, I think follows pretty closely what the actual Christian church experienced, with the purity of Jesus saying, "You're not so with you. You don't lord it over one another the way the Pharisees do or the way the Romans do. Not so with you. You're all brothers. You have already one Father. Call no man Father. You already have a Father. Call no man Rabbi. You already have a teacher." And that idea of those functions of the one another's being the emphasis in the first century, but then slowly as we move into the second century, you have guys like Cyprian and some other guys where eventually you get to the point where, well, if the bishop isn't present, by the way, he used to be an overseer facilitator, now he's the bishop, and if he's not there, you probably shouldn't even meet. Right. And so it's interesting that you marked out that progression, and unfortunately we can see that if we lay that kind of template over church history, we see that as well.
Well, and I hadn't really thought about it that way, but again, I just finished the Pilgrim Church book, and that's basically his, though not broken down in any way like that, but what he does is he traces that line of folks that sort of weave through all the wreckage,
yep.
And try and maintain that primitive, is what he calls it, the primitive church, that connection. And reliance on the scriptures and serving one another and all of those things through history. And he does a pretty compelling job, but I agree.
Yeah.
And I think that, there are pieces of this that we don't call unhealthy. What we call is normal evangelical Christian life.
Yeah. Which is, that in itself is kind of dangerous. Yeah. The thing you mentioned too about submission, and I know I've quoted this here a couple times before, but it bears repeating. The idea, the biblical definition of submission when it comes to the church, submission is something that you grant. It's not something you demand. And if someone's demanding submission to them or to the organization or to the church, that's a huge red flag. Submission is something that you are encouraged to willingly, out of love, out of common respect, out of a sense of we're all family here. Submission is something that you grant, not something that you demand. If someone's demanding it, that's a huge red flag. And the other example, too, is there's another group that they're called the Bruderhof. Do you know who they are?
No.
Okay, so there's an excellent book by a guy named Eberhard Arnold called Early Christians in Their Own Words. And it's one of my go-to books. I love it. It's almost 90% just straight quotes of early church fathers in their own words, and he groups all the quotes by categories. So you get their quotes about what church should be like, or what community is like, or what giving is like, or what their views on how they relate to the secular world, the state, or to nonviolence, or loving your enemy and that kind of thing, and or caring for the poor, etc. So it's an excellent book. And so I was reading, kind of researching it, this guy who wrote it, and he actually did start sort of a house church style group, I believe in Germany. And then they got oppressed. It might have been during World War II. And so they escaped, and they ended up somewhere, I think, in Pennsylvania, and had these series of house churches, which again, in the beginning, were very much, something we would look at and say, well, this is really good. This is really healthy. In fact, as I'm reading about it, I'm thinking, wow, I wonder if they're still there. That just sounds wonderful. I'd like to go see them. Well, the sad thing is they are still there, and they have become a very controlling, frankly, very hateful group of people that people around them kind of avoid them. And a lot of people have testimonies of escaping that place and have really sad stories. But what ended up happening when it started off, it was very pure. It was not about any one person. But slowly over time, it became a group of elders who, it's exactly what you're saying. They demanded submission. By the way, they demand all your money when you come into this thing. Like, you hand them your bank account and they own it. and any money you make goes to the community and it belongs to them. But of course, only a few of them, the elders, get to decide where that money gets divided up and where we're going to spend it. So someone's deciding what to do with the money. It's just not you. But so anyway, it was kind of sad to me to realize that here's another example of a group that started off with great intentions, but unfortunately ended up something really kind of toxic. And I think the things you pointed out are excellent, red flags. Like, if there's one charismatic leader who's the guy who does all the talking, all the teaching, all the planning, it all revolves around that guy, you should get out. If it's a group of elders and they're a special anointed, group of people who are better and smarter and more spiritual than everybody else, you probably should think about getting out. And so it's those kind of red flags where, because once that starts happening, even if at the moment nothing's bad, it won't be long before it will eventually get that way. It's just, and I also wanted to say something that you pointed out. I think this is important to say, because I think it's really easy when you have been in something like you're describing to remember situations where, well, these people, they were doing this and they were acting like that and they were talking this way and they were behaving that way and they were doing this to us and not doing that the way they should have been, and to have those recollections about those people as if the problem was that particular person was especially evil, or that particular person's personality is what made this whole thing rotten. And understand that no, that isn't what's going on. They're good people. They love the Lord. They are doing the best they can. But what's going on is there's this system that has taken on a life of its own and forces them to act in a way that isn't right. It's that sense of fear and that sense of control and that sense of shame and that feeling of I'm desperate that no one knows what's behind my mask. So let me point out quickly, look over here how screwed up that guy is, because I'm hoping you'll look at him and not at me. Like, those kinds of things aren't intrinsically about that person being bad. It's about a system which unfortunately puts good people in bad situations. And then they begin to act in ways that, they themselves would remember those situations that they were in and things they did and things they said and say, why did I do that? That's, that was really wrong. In other words, without that system, in other words, they wouldn't treat people that way. They wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and I think, again, to me, I think I've mentioned this before, it's sort of nature and nurture. If you get people, my experience is this, people that want to be in an environment that's organic and participatory, want to belong. And as something matures, as it grows, especially, growth is like the number one. To me, growth is like the number one influence for unhealthiness. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Because we start relying on all our sort of natural feelings of how things ought to be, and we try and control outcomes, and as a consequence, then we start doing these things to one another. Then we have standards, and then we have this, and then we have that. And I appreciate standards and certain things like that in training environments. If I'm training to go to the mission field, then I have to have a certain amount of discipline and some standards that I'm at least become acquainted with that serve me in that environment.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
But when those standards become what we then paint everybody with, okay, and they become the measure of my godliness, right? Then we've crossed that borderline. And I know people in our midst who were incredibly conflicted by what they felt they had to do.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And again, the environment put you in a situation where you responded, felt that you needed to respond in a certain way to another that was harmful and unhealthy.
Right.
And you get conflicted. In my own case, there were situations over the last 2-3 years where my health just went in the toilet. And part of it, our neighbor, who it was sort of after the fact, she said, there must be some really immense conflict in your life for you to be sick like this all the time.
Yeah.
And when that thing blew apart, and when my piece and sort of the end of it was done, within 6 months, I didn't have those problems. And I think that's, again, maybe that's the eighth component there, right? Is a lack of healthiness and happiness and joy in the midst of it, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's true.
But I agree with you. Sometimes really great people, really good people, but get put in an environment where the expectation is for them to do things that are really hurtful and harmful. Now, I think that doesn't excuse it.
Right.
Excuse me, it doesn't excuse anyone. I needed to face my participation in those things and just say no.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the courage to walk away comes in. And regardless of what the group says about you or individuals say about you, you need to just walk away.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing too, I wanted to just say an amen to, as you were talking. Some of the last couple of things that you pointed out, the idea about fear of outsiders, fear of doing anything with any other groups, so your group kind of becomes a little more exclusive, and you really are more afraid that you're going to lose people. And I think you're right about that, but what you're fearing is losing power and losing influence and losing control over people. And the fear is that once the exodus begins, it may not stop. Right. The other thing is that idea, the thing you pointed out about, you begin to start to feel as if your group is a little more special than others. And man, I have been in those kinds of churches where, like someone would stand up on a Sunday morning and say, we just understand this part of God's character better than anybody else. Isn't it wonderful that God has given us this gift? And that we understand intimacy with the Father in a way that no one else does. The Baptists don't understand that. The Methodists don't understand that. We really feel sorry for them. Let's pray for them, because we really have this special thing, this special anointing that no one else has. And I've heard that in many different groups that I've been a part of, where you just start to get that feeling of how much better we are. You start patting yourself on the back about something that you think you get more than anyone else. And I want to say, house churches need to be very careful of that. That, to me, that begins on day one. Because what you end up having is, and let me tell you, if you don't know, if you're in a house church, you know what I'm about to say is the truth. You know it is true that you end up with people who come to your house church. And I always talk about it as you need this season of sort of detoxing. But what we mean by detoxing is this sort of a gripe session of constantly saying, I can't believe the traditional church, they do it the wrong way, and the way they're doing it is so horrible, and they're so dumb, and I can't believe I was a part of that. I'm so glad I'm not part of that anymore. And to a degree, I think that's okay. I think, give them one meeting, their first time there, to just get it out of their system. Yep, praise God. Isn't that great? You got it. God showed you something you didn't realize. That's not his plan for the body. He wants to be the head. He wants you to be a member of the body. Okay, but now you're here. So let's just stop dwelling on that and start doing it. And so, in other words, house church groups, I think if you're not very vigilant, the whole point of your house church group, your meeting week to week, can just be a session of sitting there going on and on about how you know something no one else does, and you figured out something no one else has figured out, and how stupid they are for doing it the wrong way. But the thing is, you're spending more time talking about how they're doing it wrong and you're doing it right than you're actually spending doing it. And that's actually been one of my frustrations, where, somebody will come into our group and they have that detox period, and they just complain, or pat themselves in the back over and over again about how wonderful it is that we're allowing Christ to be the head. And I'm like, no, we're not. Because you haven't shut up. Christ isn't the head, you are. You're sitting there, we're spending all of our time listening to you go on and on and on about how great it is that we're not like them, or how great it is we've discovered this wonderful thing about how Christ should be the head, but we're not actually shutting up and waiting on the Lord and allowing him to let's start practicing this wonderful thing we've supposedly discovered. And so I would just caution house churches, don't swim in that toxic, don't just, I mean, like I said, if somebody needs the first time they're there, they've just finished reading the Pagan Christianity, or they've just finished going to a conference with John Zenz or Milton Rodriguez or whatever. They've had their big epiphany. They realized what was God's calling them misdirection. Great. Get it off your chest, because I don't ever want to hear you talk about that again. We want to move on to doing it, not talking about it.
Well, and I think this goes back to that thing of the culture of shaming and blaming. This is just Pharisaical blame shifting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once I've expressed why I've moved on, then I've moved on.
Right. Right.
And this is not the place of, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like that publican.
Yes.
I do this, and I give tithes, and I go sit in a house, and I worship in purity and in spirit and in truth, and you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
And I think that to me is again the sort of warning sign of unhealthiness.
Yep.
Is that there's, because part of what I think you're doing when you shift blame to what the others don't see, don't get, and don't do, is really try to mask what you don't see, don't get, and don't do.
Oh, exactly. You know what? Yeah, and you know what? How many times I have had to, correct that kind of talk, where someone will be, kind of going on this rampage about, and there's a specific example of someone kind of mocking, the traditional churches, the way they handle evangelism, it's just so wrong, and the way they're doing it is the wrong way, and don't they know this? People don't like getting, tracts shoved in their face, and they don't like, these events where they get tricked into coming, and you give them a bottle of water with your name of your church on it, and blah, blah, blah. That's just the wrong way, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, well, that's great. So now let's talk about all the right ways that we've been evangelizing this week. Right. Right. Because now you want to start talking about what we're doing right. It's easy to talk about what other people are doing wrong. All right, now let's talk about what we've been doing right. I mean, actually doing, not a philosophy. We've done it. We're doing it better. Well, then it suddenly becomes, no, we're not really doing it either. So, and that's very unhealthy. And I think it's a very slippery slope to just spend your time going on and about that, and pointing fingers.
And to me, that's the wall building.
Yep.
Right? They're different. We don't want them in here. We stand on the ramparts and throw hot oil down, kind of deal, because they got it so wrong. And I think, to me, Keith, and again, this is sort of where I spread this sort of warning of unhealthiness across a much broader landscape. Because I think you're right. You go to different places, and there's this sort of attitude of goddedness. Instead of the humility, if you really did grasp that,
yep.
Like Paul said, I went up to the seventh heaven. I saw things I can't even talk about. And he didn't, use it as a club to beat him with.
Nope.
What he could talk about, he talked about as eloquently and as passionately as he could.
Right, and actually in that very passage, his whole emphasis is weakness. His whole emphasis is that in spite of all that, I will boast all the more in my weakness. Because it's in that, he says, is the power of Christ at work in me, is my weakness. And I think that's the flip side of the coin of what you're describing. Instead of people being afraid of their weakness and living in this fear that their mask is going to fall down and someone's going to see their weakness, Paul's whole thing is, no, listen, we're all weak. All of us are weak. We're all covered with our weakness. Don't hide it. Realize it. Again, it brings you to a place of humility to say, and yet, Jesus is living in me by his Spirit right now. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Not because of me. Look how weak I am. Look how frail I am. Look, it's one of those things where people would look at you if they really knew you. This is why they need to really know you. It's why people need to see who you are without your mask. So that when they see Christ working in you, they say, well, that isn't Keith. I know Keith, that's not him. That's God at work in him. And so, but if they think, if my mask makes me look like super Christian and nothing's ever wrong with me and everything's always wonderful with me, I never have any problems or struggles, or I never get angry or impatient or anything. I never sin. Well, then when God does something amazing through me, what do people think? Wow, I wish I could be like Keith.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's interesting. This is my wife. One of my wife's chief complaints about Facebook is you only see the happy face.
Yep.
Maybe somebody should start a weakness book, or you know what I'm saying, where
Yeah.
where we could actually be authentic and say, today I have struggled all day long with the anxiety of finance,
Hmm.
and all through the day I had to cry out to God, because I can be consumed by the concern for my finance. I'm not proposing that, but
Well, no, you
but
know why? But listen. Why people don't do that is because Facebook is not a safe place to do that. Because what if you
I
start
found that out.
right? So some people. I mean, it'd be an interesting thought experiment to do that because some people who genuinely love you would respond in an encouraging way. Some people who don't know you very well but do kind of like you would probably try to fix you. In other words, oh, you got a problem. Let me quote these 3 verses to you. These scriptures will help you. I'll pray for you. God bless you. Goodbye. And so they're just trying to fix you, but they don't know what else to do except here's some scriptures and I'll pray for you. And then there's the other group of people who are just waiting for you to show, and then they're going to say, "Yeah, I knew it. I knew it. You're not a guy. You're not super Christian. You don't have it all together. I knew it. And now I'm going to jump on your head a little bit, right? I'm going to dig. I'm going to twist that knife in you." And so, unfortunately, that's what you're going to get on Facebook. A couple of people who genuinely love you and care for you, who will encourage you. A few people who will try to be nice and fix you, and the rest of them who just will rip you apart like a wolf.
Sounds
Um,
like church.
doesn't it? Yeah. Unfortunately, it sounds like what
Well,
church
no,
shouldn't be, but yeah.
but again, that's why I say I want to spread that unhealthy sort of caution across a wide scope, because I think that's why we end up wearing masks in church,
Right.
because there are a couple, hopefully, that really just stand with us, and there is that acceptance and authenticity with one another.
Yeah.
And then there's, like you say, there's more than a few, I think, that would love to fix you with a couple of verses and a pat on the back and a prayer for your health.
Hmm.
Okay. And then there are those that you're afraid are going to take advantage. And this is the piece, Keith, I think, in this whole thing. What is the healthy environment? The healthy environment is where I feel safe enough that the worst about me can be known.
Yeah.
And understand that everyone else in the room is standing in that same place.
Yes.
And we rely upon that safety so that there can be healing in our midst.
Amen.
That I can be strengthened in that place of weakness, that I can be lifted up when I fall. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
And if we deny that to another, it's going to be denied to us.
That's right.
And the crazy thing is that I don't think we understand that principle. I think that somehow in that sort of unhealthy environment, we think that we can deny that other one the safe place, but somehow or another they're going to provide us with a safe place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
And then we're
Yeah.
stunned when it doesn't happen.
Right.
Then it's a bad church.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, it's got to be a priority for the group to create that safe environment that people can be real, people can share their pain, people can admit when they've completely blown it. They're free to cry, to weep, I mean, I don't want to paint the picture that our house church family is perfect, because we definitely are not. But that's something that I've been very blessed in, that over time, it didn't just happen, but over time we have really become a place that's safe, and a place where people are. I mean, because we've gotten to the point where we went through the phase where if somebody shared a weakness or shared a doubt or shared a failure, we would try to fix them. And again, we love, because we care about them, in a friendly way. Oh man, I don't want to see you like that, or why do you feel like that? Why are you thinking like that? Why are you behaving like that? Well, let me, here's some scriptures, da da da. Well, we eventually got beyond that, where people are now able to share those things, and we just listen. And if we do anything, we'll just say, can we pray? Can we just pray for you? And that's it. And here's the thing too, man. If you're in that situation with somebody, pray for them. Don't do this thing where you pretend to pray, but you're really preaching. You're not really talking to God, but you're saying things that God already knows, but you want to make sure they know it. You just love them. You don't try to give them answers. You don't try to solve their problems. You just love them and pray for them and make sure they know nothing has changed. You still love them. You care about them. You love them to death, and you're with them. The people need to know that you're with them, and they need to know as well that they're in a room full of people that are just they're broken as well. Now at the same time, I'd say there's a balance to that as well. I don't ever want to get to the point where our house church family is just a whole bunch of losers, and we're just resolved to the fact that we're never going to get it and we're never going to follow Jesus. So why bother? Like that you've just given up.
Right.
It's not that, but it's a safe place to share those doubts and fears and failures. But it's also a place where you can be honest about the fact that even though I am weak and I don't have it all figured out, God is awesome. God is good. His grace is amazing, and His power is incredible, and His wisdom and His presence is like nothing I've ever seen. And so it's got to be a safe place to share both that, the good and the bad, the reality of our weakness and the reality of the power of God, the Holy Spirit that actually does empower us to live in a way that's different from the world. And so I think that you got to balance that as well, because I think you could end up kind of slouching in the other direction where it's just a giant pity party and it's just about
Absolutely.
you know
And I think that isn't the church.
right.
He says we are more than overcomers through
Yes.
Him who loved us.
Well,
So
that's the piece. That's the piece of it where Christ is really the head.
exactly.
Once you've gotten to the negative part and you just dwell on the negative part, well, then Christ is no longer the head of the body. You've lost sight of that.
Yeah, and now it's just you know an assembly of individuals.
Yep.
And again, that I think is going back to this whole thing is what is maybe we could do one of these on what are some of the characteristics of a healthy church.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that's one of them is we're learning more and more to draw our resources daily, moment by moment. We're learning more and more about what it is to draw all of those resources from Christ.
Yep.
And finding in he says if there's any bowels of compassion, if there's any encouragement in Christ, that and Paul says, now do this, right? And you say, well, of course there's compassion, but of course there's encouragement. Well, then engage with one another.
Yep.
However God's comforted and encouraged my heart, He's done that, not just for me, but so that when you are on the other side of the room weeping and we come around you and lay hands on you and pray for you, that in my prayer there are the words of encouragement,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That don't come out of, like you say, the sermonette that I never got to share.
Yep.
But come out of the experience of my own life, the authenticity of my own relationship with Christ, and there's something that I own.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely.
That experience and lesson, and I can share that with you and be there for you in that kind of way. So,
Yeah. Amen.
but anyway,
Well, I think we did, man. I really thought this was awesome, and thank you for. I'm glad you put some thought into it and put those ideas together. That it's really great, and I hope it is a help to people listening. Yeah, if there are any other questions, I guess let us know, Tom, or anybody else listening. And then maybe both of you, Mom. Thanks for listening, Mom.
yes,
Uh,
that's funny.
all right. So anyway, I enjoyed it, man. It was great, and appreciate your time and your heart. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just thinking. Maybe down the road we might want. It doesn't have to be next time, but maybe down the road we can talk about a little bit about recovering. If you've gone through that kind of a process, if you've been through that kind of a church, how do you heal from that? How do you come back from that? And what's the recovery process look like for somebody who's been through that stuff? But we're out of
Yeah,
time.
I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
I really do. All right, appreciate it.
All right, man.
Bless you.
Love you, man. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.